Part 3, Chapter 2. 2 tents away, old Chippy McNeish was also writing in his diary. It had been a discouraging day of muggy, dead calm weather, and the carpenter was tired. Since early morning, he had been busy coating the seams of the boats with seal blood to keep the caulking in once they were in the water. No wind of any kind, he wrote. We are still in hope of a southwest breeze to relieve us before the winter sets in. The next morning, 3 seals were sighted, and Macklin was sent out with Tom Crean to fetch them. When they returned, Shackleton told Macklin that since the party now had a fair supply of meat, his dogs would not be killed quite yet. Hurley's team, though, including the leader Shakespeare, the biggest of all the dogs, was shot. Wild, as usual, was executioner, and he took the dogs over to a distant floe to kill them. Macklin later found one of the dogs still alive, and immediately took out his knife and stabbed the animal to death. About 3 p.m., the wind gently eased around to the southwest, and a chill came into the air. Throughout the night, the temperature crept downward, and all the next day, the southwest breeze held steady. That night, Shackleton wrote, almost timorously, "This may be the turn in our fortune." By now, the wind was not taken lightly. "It is spoken of with reverence," Hurley observed, "and wood must be touched when commenting thereon." Somebody, it appeared, had touched the proper piece of wood. The wind came on the next day, a whole gale out of the southwest, with driving snow filling the air and the tents quaking with its violence. They huddled in their sleeping bags, dismally unfortunate but radiantly happy. 50 miles an hour, McNeish recorded blissfully, but it is welcome and is much more, as long as the tents stand. It howled on into January 19th, unabated. Shackleton, the man of unbridled optimism, confined himself to guarded phrases, lest he somehow hex this glorious wind. "We ought to be making north some now," he said with the utmost restraint. On the 20th, as the gale continued, a very few of them began to tire of the wet from the wind-driven snow filtering into the tents. "We are never satisfied," Hurley wrote, "as we are looking forward to a fine day. Our gear in the tents is becoming very wet, and the opportunity of drying, same, will be hailed." But most of them cheerfully endured the dreadful conditions, happy in the knowledge that they must be making good progress to the north. "One hardly likes to guess what our distance may be," Shackleton wrote, more boldly. "But tonight is the 4th of this blow, and there are no signs of it abating, so we ought to have made a good distance to the north. Lees and Worsley are the only pessimistic ones in the camp, but this strong wind even made Lees suggest larger stakes on the strength of our distance." The next day the gale roared on, with a few gusts to 70 miles an hour, but twice during the morning the sun broke through the clouds. Worsley was ready with his sextant, and James stood by with his theodolite to catch the angle of the sun. They took their sights, worked out the calculations, and announced the result. "Wonderful, amazing, splendid," Shackleton wrote. "Latitude 65 degrees 43 minutes south, 73 miles north drift. The most cheerful good fortune for a year for us. We cannot be much more than 170 miles from Paulet." Everyone greeted the news with cheers. "The wind still continues. We may get another 10 miles out of it. Thank God. Drifting still all wet in the tents, but no matter." Had Bannock to celebrate north of the circle. The Antarctic Circle now lay near a full degree of latitude behind them. The gale eased down the following day, and the sun shone brightly. All hands emerged from their tents, glad to be alive. They took oars from their boat and drove them into the ice, rigged lines between them, and hung up sleeping bags, blankets, boots, and floor cloths. "One would have thought it was our washing day," McNeish reported cheerfully. Later in the day, Worsley got another sight, which put their position at 65 degrees 32.5 minutes south, 52 degrees 4 minutes west, 11 miles north in 24 hours. It brought the total run since the beginning of the gale to 84 miles in 6 days. Furthermore, the drift to the east away from land amounted to only a paltry 15 miles. By evening, the gale had blown itself out, and the wind shifted to the north, but nobody minded. A northerly wind was just what they needed to open up the pack so that they could take to the boats. The wind continued into the next day without loosening the pack perceptibly. They waited. The following day, Worsley climbed to the top of a 60-foot berg, a short distance to the southeast. He returned with the news that the floe on which Ocean Camp had stood had apparently been blown closer during the gale and was now only about 5 miles away. Through the glasses, he had seen the old wheelhouse storeroom and the third boat, the Stancomb Wills. What about open water? Worsley shook his head. None, he said, except a small patch far to the south. Still, the opening would come. It was bound to. A heavy mist rolled in on January 25th, and to McNeish, it was a proper sea fog, indicating the presence of the ice-free ocean nearby. Shackleton, too, thought it must be a sea fog, but the opening still did not come, and the boss felt his patience growing within. On the 26th, after a day of unrelieved monotony, he took his diary and wrote across the space provided for that day. Waiting, waiting, waiting. But by the time a week had passed, most of the men were abandoning their hopes. They could see almost no change in the pack. If anything, it was tighter than before, packed together by the force of the winds, perhaps driven against some unknown land to the north or northwest. The sense of immediacy gradually diminished, and the atmosphere in camp settled once more into reluctant resignation. Fortunately, the men were kept fairly well occupied. At the new position, game was abundant, and all hands were busy hunting seals and sledging them into camp. By January 30th, 8 days after the gale ended, they had laid in a stock of 11 seals. Shackleton decided to send Macklin's and Greenstreet's teams on another trip to Ocean Camp. Since Greenstreet, who had been suffering an attack of rheumatism for about 2 weeks, could not make the trip, his team was assigned to Crean. The two men were instructed to bring back anything of value they could find. This time sledging conditions were considerably better, and the trip took less than 10 hours. The teams returned with some odds and ends of stores, including a quantity of canned herring, 60 pounds of bouillon cubes, and a large amount of tobacco. They also obtained a good number of books, among them several volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which were especially welcome. Even McNeish, a devout Presbyterian, allowed as how he would enjoy a change from his Bible, which he had repeatedly reread from cover to cover. For the next 2 days, Shackleton carefully observed the movements of the pack, and then he decided that a party of 18 under Wild should start out early the next morning to bring up the Stancomb Wills. The news came as a great relief. For some time, many of the men, particularly the seamen, had had strong misgivings about the advisability of trying to crowd the entire party into 2 boats. "I am very glad," Worsley wrote. "If it comes to boats, we shall be far safer in 3. With only 2, it would be a practical impossibility to bring 28 men alive through a boat voyage of any length." The sledging party was awakened at 1 a.m. the next morning, and after a good heavy breakfast, they started off, dragging an empty boat sledge with them. It was an easy journey with so many men, and they arrived 2 hours and 10 minutes later. Wild appointed Hurley cook, with James as his mate, and General Hoosh stirrer. They put together a meal of anything they could find, and it wound up a mixture of dog pemmican, baked beans, and canned cauliflower and beets, cooked together in an empty gasoline can. Macklin pronounced it very good, and James remarked with satisfaction that it was a great success. The party started back for Patience Camp at 6:30 a.m., and while the ongoing was considerably heavier, they made good progress. They were within a mile of their goal by noon. Shackleton and Hussey went out to meet them with a pot of hot tea. "The most welcome tea I ever had," James reported. The Stancomb Wills was safe in camp by 1 o'clock. Shackleton immediately asked Macklin if he felt too tired to go back again to Ocean Camp, this time with his team, to bring up a further load of supplies. Macklin agreed and set off at 3 p.m., with Worsley and Crean, who had taken over the puppy team. Less than 2 miles from Ocean Camp, they were stopped by large leads of open water. Worsley tried desperately to talk the sledgemen into pressing on. He ran up and down along the edges of the floes, pointing out possible ways to get across, which were really quite impossible, Macklin said. I was sorry for him, but it would have been foolish to have continued under the circumstances. Worsley wrote in his diary that night how disappointed he was that they had been forced to turn back, but added, "I was very pleased that the pack had kept solid long enough to bring our third boat across." He also noted, "I think many of our stomachs are rebelling against the excessive meat diet. I expect we will soon get used to it, but I think it would be better for us if we cooked some blubber with it. A good many of us suffer from, to put it mildly, flatulence, and what might almost be described as squeaky gut. Actually, it was not a humorous matter. As a result of their short rations, almost all of the men were constipated, which complicated what was already a very disagreeable chore. The usual procedure, whenever a man felt the need, was to go off behind a nearby pressure ridge, more for protection against the weather than for privacy, and get the job done as quickly as possible. Since one of the items they had been forced to do without since abandoning the Endurance was toilet paper, they had to substitute the only disposable material at hand, ice. Thus, almost all of them were badly chafed, and unfortunately, treatment was impossible since all the ointments and most of the medicines were now at the bottom of the Weddell Sea. In cold weather, they were also greatly troubled, with their eyes watering. The tears ran down a man's nose and formed an icicle on the end, which sooner or later had to be broken off. And no matter how carefully it was done, a little patch of skin invariably came off with it, leaving a chronically unhealed sore on the end of his nose. The trip to Ocean Camp to bring up the Stancomb Wills changed the attitude of many men. Until then, some vestige of anticipation that the pack might open had remained. But they had observed during the 12-mile round-trip journey to Ocean Camp that the ice was tighter than ever. The days of wishful thinking were over. There was nothing to do but sit down and wait. But after day dragged by in a gray, monotonous haze, the temperatures were high and the winds were light. Most of the men would have liked to sleep the time away, but there was a limit to the number of hours a man could spend inside his sleeping bag. Every available time-killing pastime was exploited to the fullest, and often much beyond. On February 6th, James wrote, "Hurley and Boss play religiously a set of 6 games of poker patience every afternoon. I think each rather regards it a duty, but it certainly passes away an hour. The worst thing is having to kill time. It seems such a waste, yet there is nothing else to do." Each day became so much like the one before that any unusual occurrence, however small, generated enormous interest. "We got quite homesick tonight," James wrote on the 8th, "at the smell of a piece of burning twig, which we found in some old seaweed. Any new smell or small bringing old associations appeals to us in a wonderful way. Probably we smell ourselves a little ourselves and would be very noticeable to strangers, since it is nearly 4 months since we had a bath. Just now," he continued, "we regard the panels of our tents most earnestly to see which bellies out under the influence of the wind. I long for a place where the direction of the wind does not matter a tinker's cuss. We also suffer from pneumonia, literally wind madness," he wrote later. "This disease may be exhibited in 2 forms, either one in morbidly anxious about the wind direction and gibbers continually about it, or else a sort of lunacy is produced by listening to the other and I apologize, these are words I've never really come across before. Lunacy is produced by listening to the other amenomaniacs. We'll stick with that. The second form is more trying to hear. I have had both. Only one topic other than the wind was sure to spark a discussion: food. Early in February, they had gone for almost 2 weeks without getting a seal, and while their meat supply was not yet too small, their stock of blubber for cooking was alarmingly low, only about enough for 10 more days. On February 9th, Shackleton wrote, "No seals. Must reduce blubber consumption. Oh, for a touch of dry land under our feet." The following day, a party of men were set to digging into the snow-covered refuse heap to recover all possible blubber from the bones there. Seal flippers were cut up, and the decapitated heads of seals were skinned and scrapped of every trace of blubber they would yield. But the amount obtained was insignificant, so Shackleton reduced their ration to 1 warm beverage a day. A serving of hot powdered milk at breakfast. The last of their cheese was served out the next day, and each man received a 1-inch cube. McNeish commented, "I smoked myself sick through trying to stifle the hunger this afternoon." They had looked forward to Shackleton's birthday on February 15th, when a good meal had been promised them, but owing to lack, Macklin wrote, we cannot have it. We are going to have a bannock made with flour and dog pemmican and are looking forward to it. Then on the morning of February 17th, as the blubber situation was becoming really desperate, somebody saw a flock of little penguins, about 20 altogether, sunning themselves a short distance from the camp. A score of men seized any weapons that were handy, axe handles, picks, lengths of broken oars, and crept cautiously along almost on their hands and knees. They stealthily surrounded the flock, cutting off their escape into the water. When everybody was in position, the men rushed forward, clubbing furiously at the squawking, skittering adelies. They secured 17 penguins in all. Other little bands were sighted during the morning, and parties of men were sent out to get them. Before a dense fog rolled in early in the afternoon, they had a total of 69 penguins. Later in the day, as they sat in their fog-shrouded tents, the men could hear adelies in every direction, calling and quarreling in their raucous voices. Had the weather been clear, Worsley wrote, we probably would have seen hundreds. Despite the welcomed addition to their larder, supper that night was frugal, consisting, McNeish noted, of stewed penguin heart, liver, eyes, tongues, toes, and God knows what else, with a cup of water to wash it down. I don't think any of us will have nightmares from overeating. After supper, a northeast gale came up, with heavy snow falling. It continued the next day, forcing the men to remain inside their tents, but all the while the croaking of adelies continued. The weather finally cleared on February 20th. As soon as it was light, the men emerged from their tents, and it seemed almost as if it were in the midst of an adelie rookery. Thousands of penguins dotted the pack in every direction, strutting around the floes, frolicking in the water, and making a frightful racket. The penguins must have been migrating north. The patient's camp, fortunately, lay in the path of their trek. All hands were put to the slaughter, bringing in every penguin that could be reached. By nightfall, they had killed, skinned, gutted, and cut up 300 penguins. The following morning, the men saw that the migration had moved on as suddenly as it had arrived. But though only about 200 penguins were observed during the day, the men managed to kill about 50. For several days afterwards, small bands of stragglers continued to appear, and by February 24th, the party had secured a total of nearly 600. The penguins, however, is a small and not very meaty bird, so that the amount of food obtained was not nearly as impressive as might be supposed. Furthermore, there is very little blubber on an adelie. Nevertheless, the sudden appearance of them had removed, for the moment, the most serious threat they faced, starvation. And with starvation no longer in immediate danger, their thoughts inevitably turned once more to their ultimate escape. Greenstreet observed, the food now is pretty well all meat. Seal steaks, stewed seal. Penguin steaks, stewed penguin. Penguin liver, the latter being very good indeed. The cocoa had been finished for some time, and the tea is very nearly done, and soon our only beverage will be powdered milk. Flour also is very nearly finished and is now only used with dog pemmican in the making of bannocks, which are damn fine. Our distance from Pollet I, is now 94 miles, which means we have completed 3/4 of the distance we had to do when we got on the floe. I wonder if we shall ever get there. Macklin noted, we have just been 1/3 of a year on the floe, drifting as nature has wailed. I wonder when we shall see home again. And James, ever the scientist, put it into laboratory terms. We make all kinds of theories based sometimes on what we see about us of ice conditions, but more of this based on nothing at all. Can't help thinking of theory of relativity. Anyhow, we have only an horizon of a few miles, and the Weddell Sea is roughly 20 or 200,000 square miles. Actually, it is closer to 900,000 square miles. A bug on a single molecule of oxygen in a gale of wind would have been about the same chance of predicting where he was likely to finish up.